I'd like to go on to the next speaker. I'm actually going to say a couple of words here. Guten Abend, Alex. That's correct, isn't it? Yes. Yes, I did do German for O-level, and we were told we had to write about a famous German, and everybody chose a composer. And who did I choose? Franz Beckenbauer, the footballer. So I did get a reasonable German O-level, but enough about that. On now to Alex. Alex was born in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. He studied philosophy, Jewish studies, Greek and Roman history at Frankfurt University. Thereafter, he studied Jewish studies at Oxford University. He is a professor. Alex is currently the Professor of Jewish Thought in the Department of Religions and Theology at Manchester University. Previous to that, he was a member of the Middle Eastern Studies Department. Now, Alex came to live in the UK 39 years ago, so not as long as Ahmed, but a fair amount of time. So over to you, Alex. We'd like to hear your story now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody who's here, and thank you very much to the Muslim Jewish Forum for inviting me along to talk a little bit about my how I came to be in the UK. There's a famous novel in Arabic from the middle of the 20th century called Seasons of Migration to the North by Taib Salih. In the story, the book's hero, who grows up in rural Sudan, migrates to England after having had an education in the colonial British system in Khartoum. He has some violent experiences in England, and then he returns to the Sudan. So that book is called Seasons of Migration to the North. When I look at my family's history, I see on the mother's side a Jewish family settled in the lower Rhine region of Germany for probably several generations, although I don't know. My mother grew up in Dortmund. But when I look at my father's side, I see a family who had come to Germany just before he was born. He died when I was very young, so I don't actually know him personally very much. So he had come to southwestern Germany through his parents. His parents came to southwestern Germany, which is basically the Upper Rhine area, where he was born. But his parents had only immigrated to Germany 3 years before his birth, 1908, from Odessa. Odessa was at the time a part of the Tsarist Russian Empire and a very important city in all sorts of ways, but had very harsh pogroms in the years leading up to 1905, and massacres of Jews and great incidents of anti-Semitism. So I'm assuming that has something to do with them leaving Tsarist Russia at that time. And in Germany, my father was born, and I find myself, therefore, having moved to England, to have continued over 3 generations a season of migration to the West, coming from Eastern Europe. In between this move to the West, that starts with my grandparents on the father's side and continues with myself, both my parents, my mother and my father, left Germany and met in Israel, where my father had fled to British Palestine Mandate first, and then State of Israel after, where my father had fled to after the Nazis took power in Germany. And I still have the documents by which the German state took away my grandparents' German citizenship in the wake of the 1935 Nuremberg laws against their Jewish population. But both my parents returned to Germany. They had met and married in Israel. They returned to Germany in the 1950s. And I was born in 1960 in Frankfurt am Main. And I grew up in a small town about 100 kilometers east of Frankfurt called Fulda. I was brought up by my mother, who was by that time a widow and never married again. And she was a very unconventional and strong woman, trying to be both a father and a mother to me, I suppose. And it worked. I've never missed not having a father. I should say that I'm an only child. So we were in Fulda, which is a small town of about 60, 70,000 people. We were one of a group of perhaps 20 or 30 Jews in that town, but we knew of their existence only indirectly. It was not widely known that we were Jews, and there was no Jewish community, functional Jewish community in that town at that time. We didn't live a religious life. So, but we had a strong Jewish identity via ideas of identifying with a shared history and an idea of an ethnic link, not least to the victims of the Holocaust, of which I had a very everyday awareness since early childhood. So I encountered very little anti-Semitism when growing up, partly because presumably our low Jewish profile, but partly also because it was pretty unacceptable in Germany at that time in that place to show anti-Semitism in an open way. That has clearly changed. Because of my strange name though, and my darker skin, I was regularly called spaghetti in school, which I found highly amusing. Italian guest workers were prominent in Fulda at the time. And I was mistaken for one of them and called by the only Italian name that everybody knew. Anyway, I was thinner then, so I may have invoked the idea of a single spaghetti strand. I took it as a compliment, and I thought of the local Italians and all other targets of prejudice as honorary Jews. So, but despite not being the target of anti-Semitism in a personal manner really at all, I grew up with some very deep-seated everyday suspicions of my environment. Everyone I met who was in their 50s or older, I was wondering what they had done in the war, at least before I could get to know them better. So it wasn't an entirely unfair attitude, but it was hardly a healthy situation for me. Going to German schools until A-level, I saw how the teaching of Nazi history happened in schools and how the subject pervaded other subjects, not just history, in school. I knew a lot more about the period than most of my peers because I was reading constantly about it. But I found that the basics of that period got taught fairly and well in school. I was motivated partly because of my awareness of the Holocaust to make Jewish studies my main, or one of my main subjects at university alongside philosophy. And as a student at Frankfurt University, I met other Jewish students for the first time quite regularly and began to have contact as well with the Jewish community structures of post-war Germany. Now, the Jewish community in Germany in the 1970s and 80s had about 30,000 members. That was before the influx of Russian Jews after the fall of the wall. And those members mostly came originally from Poland and other Eastern European Jewish communities that were destroyed by the Nazis. So the post-war Jewish community had a discourse going of thinking of themselves as not quite wanting to be there, not quite wanting to be in post-war Germany, of being there by accident, of being there, but sitting on packed suitcases, as they called it, and ready to leave at a moment's notice. Although individually my situation was quite different, I understood that general sentiment very, very easily. So I also felt a tension with being Jewish in Germany, which was humming away in the background, if you like. What wasn't in the background were some other things that I lived through and that I experienced in a certain way, a certain kind of cultural or social dissonance. I found myself in a situation where I got the feeling that life, everyday life in Germany was actually quite rude in certain ways and socially oppressive. People were obsessed with each other to some extent, with each other's behavior, and one was kind of constantly being observed. I had that feeling of being observed. And even years later, when all I did was occasionally, well, quite frequently, visit my mother, I sometimes didn't get out of the airport without having a first little row with somebody who I thought was treating me rudely or unnecessarily aggressively, sometimes officials. I tried to be careful and not end up in some kind of detained state at the border. But it was surprising how ill-tempered I found German social life, anonymous social life, not family life, of course, not private life, to be. I was also instinctively an Anglophile in the sort of vague romanticizing way in which one likes the culture of another country in which one has never lived. And I still am, I suppose, an Anglophile. But when I had the opportunity then to study in Oxford for a year, I jumped at it. And I was not disappointed, except by the heating system in my room and some other practicalities that didn't work. So after that 1 year, I went back to Frankfurt and finished my MA there, and then returned on another scholarship for a doctorate. And that was a doctorate in Jewish studies at Oxford. And that was in 1985, and I've been in the country ever since 1989, here in Manchester. Living here has done me a world of good, really. It allowed me, among other things, to develop a much more balanced relationship to my Jewish identity. The kind of pressure cooker life that one had as a post-war young Jewish person in post-war Germany took it out of you. And when I came together with Jewish students once or twice on large conference occasions, the Society of Jewish Students, for example, organized national meetings. I could find myself in a room of people, for 200 to 300 people, and I thought quite a few of them are very obviously, in some sense, highly strung, too neurotic, and some of that I put down to the very difficult, in some sense, disturbing situation in which they found themselves without having chosen to be in that situation. Anyway, I was obviously to some extent also affected by this, and being in England has done me good in that respect, as in other respects. In various social contexts in which I find myself, which are not restricted to the university, but of course the university is a very important part of it. I have found Britain on the whole very welcoming, tolerant, self-deprecating, a kind of self-awareness that is rarer in other countries, and quite relaxing for me. So, and I can't actually think offhand of a single incident of open anti-Semitism that was directed at me personally as a particular person. So in that sense, I've had a very, very happy experience. Thank you.